everybody. My name is Eamon. I'm from Pascal & Watson Architects. I'm a project director at Pascal & Watson. I have never done this before, so apologies in advance if I'm crap. I'll be doing my best. I'm here for most of the morning until lunchtime. I'd like firstly to welcome Lee Stolworthy from Stantec, who I have not met before. Most importantly, and Lee is a senior associate transport planner based in the Birmingham office for Stantec. He's involved with multiple land development projects delivering houses, jobs, social and community facilities. Some good keywords in there. He's driven by passion for finding new ways to positively contribute to building an innovative and human-orientated transport future. This morning, Lee is going to be tackling the issue of combining humans and engineering systems. Is that fair? In his talk named City Shaping and Supporting Behavioural Change, Better Integration Between Land Use and Transport. Over to you, Lee.
Thank you very much. Morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2. I didn't opt for one of those dancing microphones, so I'm going to be routed to the lectern, unfortunately. I am an incurable transport planner, but you are my support group. Thank you for that. But sometimes when I meet people for the first time, a new person, someone that's not in the industry, I don't say that I'm a transport planner. It's a bit boring, it's hard to explain. So sometimes I say that I'm a hypocritical pseudo-new urbanist. And the reason for that is because urbanism is really interesting to me, because I'm interested in how people move, how cities work, how towns function, and the decisions that people make, which creates the travel demand profile that we see on towns and streets. But am I really an urbanist? Because I have a car, it's not electric. I live in a house, I have kids that go to school, so I don't really live in a city apartment, and I don't go to coffee shops on a Saturday morning with my laptop. I have a different life, but my circumstance is different, which dictates what I do and how I live my life, and ultimately how I travel. I'm trying to reduce my own carbon footprint and my household carbon footprint. I have a bike, it's also not electric. And it takes a lot of motivation for me to cycle the 1 hour every day to the office and the 1 hour back. I do it sometimes, and our company provides all the facilities that I need to do that, but my life doesn't enable me to do that on a consistent basis. It's not that easy. So I think about all of these things. What are the decision drivers for me which determine the way that I travel and where I live, and schools and things like that, and dogs and children and houses and cars? And what is the problem that they need to solve, and how do I need to change my behavior? How can I change my behavior? Because I want to, because climate guilt is a real thing, not just reserved for younger generations. It's because we're stuck in this vicious cycle of building more and more roads and then wondering why we have more and more cars. Because historically, the car has dictated our spatial form to a certain extent, because we have this inefficient spatial form between trip-producing and trip-attracting land uses, which determines how people travel. And as a result of that, it's really hard to produce viable and affordable public transport systems where you can sell tickets in both directions and people can travel seamlessly between those. I think Sarah mentioned that earlier on. It's hard to find a good example of an integrated and seamless public transport system. All of these inefficiencies together lead to increase in carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that the transport sector is contributing, the domestic transport is contributing 28% of all carbon. Of that, 90% is for road-based transport. People driving in cars, buses, and all of those kind of things. So we know that we need to reduce all of that. And in the graphic that you see on there at the bottom on the right-hand side is from some of the work that we're doing on bridging the gap. We have a round table, I think it's now table 10, session 2, please come to that. And what that does is it looks at the 6 carbon budget against what our potential carbon target is going to be if we don't change our behaviours, or if we change our behaviours in different ways based on different scenarios. And how do we bridge that gap? And what is the societal readiness required to change behaviours to bridge that gap? We know that in a paper that Greg Marsden produced, a professor on reverse gear, that car travel, if we have any hope of closing that carbon gap, car travel needs to reduce by 20%. But how can we reduce car travel when the reasons that we travel aren't changing? The land use inefficiencies remain. Because land use is the mother of travel demand. This is a statement that you probably haven't heard before, maybe you don't hear it every day. It's not a famous quote by anyone. I made it up just to remind myself what to say next, really. It's because we need to access stuff to live our lives, and where that stuff is in space determines how we travel to it. a good way to look at that and the building blocks and all the various elements to understand how this works is the triple axis approach to planning. Now, I promised myself that I wouldn't use jargon, but here we have it, triple axis planning. And how this works is that on the bottom axis, you have proximity-based access. So where things are in you in relation to space determines how you travel. So the better your proximity-based access, the lower your mobility requirements, and the less infrastructure and public transport you need to provide to meet that mobility requirement. On the right-hand side, you have digital access, which has changed. It's been accelerated since COVID, but it's not utilized as much as possible. And somewhere in there is a relationship between those three axes and some examples of what kind of transport systems could be provided. If you look closely, I don't know if you can see it from the back, but you'll see 15-minute cities is somewhere in the middle. Do you remember last year, that whole thing that happened with 15-minute cities? And it's a sinister government plot to control the population, like the Hunger Games. It's funny, but it's not really funny that people have that perception. And so understanding and how to manipulate these different moving parts and these variables is really useful in trying to understand how we can think about them to create a future for transport that we want. So how do we do that? How do we create a vision for the future that we want? Well, one way of doing it is backcasting. So you look at a future or the characteristics of the type of future that you want and figure out what those characteristics are. A couple of years ago, I was working on building an urban development index as a rubric for urban transformation against a metropolitan spatial development framework. In that process, I met a very interesting character who was a professor from Tokyo University. He was working on a happiness index. What makes people happy? What do people need to live their lives, and how does that make them happy? At the time, I didn't have time to get into that level of detail on my urban development index, and I was constrained by the data that was available to me at the time. But recognizing the fact that we need to find a blend of quantitative data and qualitative data that starts to look at quality of life indicators rather than just the how far have you traveled, what mode have you used, for example. But we can do that. We can look at the future and sort of look at the characteristics, and we can quantify those characteristics, whether they're quantitative or qualitative. Look at where we are now. The difference between those is the change that's required. Sounds simple enough, right? There's the formula. It's easy. The problem is that the question always comes up, and I get this time and time again. What if you can't achieve that future? What if something changes? What if you can't have the sustainable transport system and active mobility everywhere? What if it doesn't work? And that uncertainty is perceived as risk. We need to figure out how to navigate that risk. And we can do that through incrementalism, by stopping and checking where we're going and adapting. If we have a plan for the future and we just stick to that plan, we're not going to get to the future that we want. We have to adapt and adjust along the way, and we can do that by incrementalism. How do we do that? With data. Data. It's becoming so critical in the work that we do now. Has anyone worked with data scientists? Amazing people. You can give a data scientist a big pile of data, and you can say, in this big pile of data is the answer to this question. And they will come back and they'll say, here's the answer to that question. Well, first they go away and they polish and they clean the data, because data scientists can't stand dirty data. And big data sets generally tend to be dirty. And then they'll come back and say, yes, there's the answer to this question, but did you know there are all these other questions in that data and all these other answers? And that's the power of looking at skill sets beyond the traditional, things that we're not really used to as transport planners and spatial planners, and leveraging those skills that we need. I don't think AI can do that yet. It can't be as intuitive. You can't have a conversation with AI like you can with a data scientist, and they can get the general feeling of what it is that you're trying to achieve and start to look for other things in the data that you may have missed. And we need to think about that a lot more. Where am I in my slides? So the other thing that we need to think about is, so if we're looking at all of this data and we look at traditional data sets, how do we know what people want from that data? We can't assume that observed behavior is preferred behavior, because people are reacting to the world as it exists. They're reacting to transport systems as they are presented to them. It doesn't mean that that's what they want. So how do we know what they want? Well, traditionally, we go and ask them. But there's a problem there. Last year, I think I was talking at a parish council meeting. We had a sustainable transport approach to a strategic land development project. And I was saying, we're going to have demand responsive transit, we're going to have bike share, we're going to have a mobility hub, and we're going to have car hire, and it's all going to be controlled through an app as a mobility as a service app. And one of the older people in the parish council said, well, that's never going to work. I don't even have a smartphone. And everyone's just going to drive cars anyway. There's two problems with that statement. One is that they are suffering from the affliction of motor normativity. Does everyone know what that is? I don't have time to explain it now, and I'd love to go down that tangent, but Ian Walker from Swansea University, 2022, wrote a paper with others on motor normativity. And it's basically the societal blind spot with regards to the car and the role of the car in society. It will always be there. We'll always have cars. There'll be a role for them somewhere. People will just keep driving them. And the other problem is that that person doesn't have a smartphone, but that's not the person that we're planning for. At the end of that local plan period in 2040, the last house that we build, say the person that occupies that house is 35 years old, that person is 19 today. Show me a 19-year-old that doesn't have a smartphone glued to their hand. That's the person that we're planning for. That's what we need to think about. But how do we understand the travel behaviors of people that haven't got travel behaviors yet? We need to look at different data sets. Right? I dropped my paper, although you did see me do that. So we need to ask the right questions, but we need to be asking the right people. But we can't ask the right people because those people don't exist yet. So we need to think about all of those things. We can explain this really by looking at scenarios and having different types of land use features and different types of transport features that respond to those. And it's easier to create that picture of what the future could look like. But we always have this question. The question remains, but what if you don't achieve that? What if the things that you do can't achieve the outcome that you want? And people keep asking that question. And the thing is that we need to just start making different decisions. And I went to a panel discussion at the end of last year, autumn sometime, on the Levelling Up and Urban Regeneration Act. And the theme for that day was, is it solution or illusion? Can it achieve the outcomes that we want it to achieve in terms of speeding up planning processes and de-risking investment, for example? And the outcome of that really was, the take-home for me is that we have sufficient policy instruments in place to be able to make meaningful change, but what we need to do is use them in the way that they were intended and stop misinterpreting them so we can carry on doing things that we've always been doing. So this is my last slide. So what do we need to do? We need to recognize behaviors that need to change, but also what is already changing, but also what the future behavior changes are likely to be, and find out ways where we can get that information. And if we talk too much about this, we'll get back into the realm of the Hunger Games. How do we find information about young people and what their travel aspirations are? Do they want to own a car in the future? Do they want to be burdened with car ownership and a house that has to have a driveway? We need to be clear about who we are planning for and what their needs are likely to be. We need to go beyond the obvious and the traditional. We need to leverage skill sets that are outside of our normal skill sets. We need to use data scientists and those kind of people. We need to understand and navigate risk and create arguments that help to navigate that so that people can make the right decisions and stop asking the what if you can't achieve it questions. We need to provide an enabling environment to de-risk investment in the types of investment that we want in land use in the places where we want it. And if the Levelling Up and Urban Regeneration Act is really about trying to streamline that process and shorten the planning process, what about if we shorten the planning process more for the types of development that we want in the places where we want it? Could that not catalyze change faster? We need to embrace technology, and Sarah touched on this earlier. Embrace technology, but be wary of a solution that is looking for a problem. Anyone that's ever worked in the innovation space will know what I'm talking about. There's no shortage of shiny gadgets looking for a problem. And really what innovation is to me, it's a state of mind. It's about how we think about and dive in and trying to find solutions to problems. And sometimes it's not that sexy. We need to consider all the variables and not just the ones that we're used to. Look at other skill sets, look at people outside of our industry to help us solve these problems, and move away from this highway first logic of investment and move towards a human-orientated transport and land use logic with regards to investment. And this second last one, this is one of my pet frustrations, is don't expect to find examples of something that hasn't been done yet. I get this all the time. This is a really good idea, Lee. We like that, and we understand what you're trying to do and the logic, but can you show me an example in the UK of where that's been applied? No, it's new. We're trying to change things. You can't find an example of it. It doesn't exist. Make a decision. Be bold, because if we don't do anything differently, nothing will change. Thank you. Enjoy the day. One last thing. This image is generated by artificial intelligence. I typed into an AI generator, generate an image of future integrated land use and transport planning. That's what it came up with. I'm not going to try and interpret it for you, but if you look carefully, you'll see one or two cars in there. This could be the year 3000, I don't know. But don't try and interpret the road markings. Only robots can do that, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lee. Not an easy thing to talk through all of that stuff in 15 minutes, and motor normativity, I think the word of the day.
Google it. It's interesting.
Not heard that one before. In relation to that, before we throw open to the floor for a question or two, I have one thing on my mind, is that when we talk about behaviours, we acknowledge the fact that ownership of 4x4s, the e-book 4x4, is still increasing despite all that we know. And then I worry that data, that ideas and well-meaningness doesn't get to the gut of why people do things, which is typically for selfish reasons. And my question is, how much is it about persuasion, and how much is regulation and force going to be necessary to get us to where we want to get to?
Thanks. I think it's a combination of the two, really. And we were having a discussion about this in the office yesterday. And one of my colleagues was saying that in France, now you pay higher parking rates if you drive an SUV. That's a policy decision, because we can't expect people to make the right decision by themselves unless there's a nudge. It's often spoken about that people make decisions to change things when the push is stronger than the pull. So it needs to become harder to do what you're still doing than it is easier to do what it is that you want to change to. And so I think we need to find a blend and a combination of pull and push factors to achieve that. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions from the floor?
I'm here all day.
I'm sure Lee would be very happy to take your questions at the break. Thank you very much, everybody. Please say thank you to Lee.